This is Need to Know with Jeff Greenfield, Maria Hinojosa, Scott Simon, and this week, Ray Suarez.
On this edition, the evangelical vote in Iowa can make or break a presidential candidate, but this time around, they are divided. Also, are the candidates missing the point about Iowans and ethanol subsidies? And from American Voices, a portrait of Iowa. Next on Need to Know. Thanks for joining us. After months and months of Republican presidential debates, the voters, finally, are about to get their say. Iowa's often critical first-in-the-nation caucuses are Tuesday, and they're our focus this week. Despite all the attention on the Hawkeye state, it's estimated fewer than 150,000 Iowans will vote next week in the Republican caucus. For Republicans, history suggests winning the Iowa caucus may not actually help secure the presidential nomination. See Mike Huckabee in 2008. But Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and John McCain all were defeated in Iowa, but were still nominated anyway. Still, all of the candidates want to secure that first victory, so to Iowa they go, especially to court the votes of conservative evangelicals, who are estimated to make up 1/3 of Republican caucus goers Tuesday. This year, Republican evangelicals in Iowa have several anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage candidates to choose from, which has kept Tuesday's outcome uncertain. Need to Know's Rick Carr reports.
There are dozens of churches in the small town of Oskaloosa, Iowa, which is about 60 miles southeast of the state capital, Des Moines. To be precise, 34 churches for just over 11,000 residents.
Oh, my God, in you I put my trust. Yes, I do.
At one of those parishes, Jubilee Family Church, 100 or so parishioners gathered on a recent chilly Sunday morning to hear a sermon about politics.
What we believe in doing is truly understanding the issues, truly understanding them from a biblical worldview, and truly understanding what the ramifications of those issues really are.
Pastor Bill Tweed told his parishioners that come caucus night, they'll face a stark choice.
You'll either put men in office who are governed by God's voice, or they're governed by something that challenges what God says.
Tweed says he plans to vote for Minnesota Representative Michelle Bachmann, but he can't just come out and endorse her from the pulpit. That would violate federal law, and his church could lose its tax-exempt status. So he plies his congregation with information, stacks of pamphlets and handbills at the back of the church's sanctuary, and sermons that focus on which political principles conform to what the church believes God says.
See, I won't endorse a candidate. I won't do that. I want you to learn how to do it. I want you to learn how to understand who to vote for and who not to vote for.
I can let my people know what the Bible says about the pertinent issues. What does the Scripture teach about abortion? What does it teach about the definition of marriage? What does the Bible teach about socialism?
Tweed says some election years only one Republican candidate in the pack measures up to his interpretation of what the Bible teaches. 4 years ago, he says it was former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. In January of 2008, he won the Iowa GOP caucuses by winning the votes of nearly half of the state's conservative evangelicals. This time, things are going to be different. When Iowa Republicans get together in buildings like the courthouse behind me for the more than 1,700 precinct meetings that make up the Iowa caucuses, there's no consensus candidate that has the support of conservative evangelicals.
With Gingrich and with Bachmann and Santorum and with Perry, Paul, and even when Kane was in the race, they're all going after a lot of that Huckabee support.
Bob Vanderplatz was chairman of Mike Huckabee's Iowa campaign in 2008. Then he led a campaign against 3 state Supreme Court justices who ruled in favor of gay marriage and ended up driving them out of office. Now he runs an advocacy group for social conservatives called The Family Leader, and Fox News calls him a kingmaker in Iowa.
The Los Angeles Times wrote that meeting with you is a prerequisite for any candidate who wants to compete in Iowa. Is that true?
I don't know if it's a prerequisite to meet with me, but I believe it's the issues that our organization represents. And our supporters are very, very sincere about these issues. They're very interested in who's going to champion these issues. Our supporters are going to show up on caucus night.
In November, the family leader hosted a forum for GOP hopefuls.
We don't need you to be Republican or Democrat, but we need you to be biblical.
And the candidates lined up to tout their fealty to socially conservative positions.
The left is prepared to impose intolerance and to drive out of existence traditional religion.
They slammed abortion rights.
I have supported the amendment that defines life at conception.
As long as abortion is legal, at least according to the Supreme Court, legal in this country, we will never have rest.
Gay marriage.
The family is defined as one man, one woman, no other definition will do.
And what they call Obamacare.
Obamacare has to go because it's trying to tell us how to deliver health care in our states.
The candidates came because conservative evangelical voters are organized and motivated. They turn up on caucus night. And endorsements from socially conservative groups like the family leader could turn one of them into the Mike Huckabee of the current campaign. But Vanderplat says none of them ended up stealing the hearts of Iowa's conservative evangelicals.
We had 6 candidates at our Thanksgiving family forum, and I think it was my wife afterwards who said, you know, Bob, if we could take those 6 and put them in a blender and just have the strings come out and have one candidate. And I said, darling, you're getting awfully close to cloning. But we would have a perfect candidate. And I think what we're realizing today, there is no perfect candidate.
Vanderplat says there are ways to determine which candidates are less imperfect than the others.
What criteria do you use? I mean, what's your sort of measuring stick for candidates?
We don't want to elect a president that we don't trust. So we're trying to determine, first of all, can we trust you? And in politics, if we can't trust you on the sanctity of human life, or if we can't trust you on God's design for the family, one man, one woman marriage, or Constitution, the appointment of justices, how would we ever trust you with the economy or national security or things of that nature? Right?
Vanderplat says that he and the family leader aren't even considering endorsing former Utah Governor John Huntsman because he hasn't campaigned in Iowa. Texas Congressman Ron Paul doesn't pass their ideological tests. When it comes to former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, some conservative evangelicals cite his inconsistency on issues.
Not that he's just been on both sides of key issues. He's been passionately on both sides of key issues.
Others say they're also troubled by Romney's Mormon faith. Remember those pamphlets at the back of Oskaloosa Pastor Bill Tweed's church? One of them argues that Mormons aren't Christians.
I look in the back of the room and I see that you have pamphlets about Mormonism. What are your concerns about Mormonism, and do they play into your issues with Mitt Romney?
Theologically, we do not agree with Mormonism. It has different doctrines than what we as an Orthodox Christian church would believe. And I believe that can have a bearing.
That leaves 4 candidates who pass muster with most of Iowa's conservative evangelicals. Representative Bachmann, former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, Texas Governor Rick Perry, and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich.
They don't know who to support. They've got 4 people they're talking about.
Doug Gross is another prominent Iowa Republican. He says he's more motivated by fiscal matters and small government than by social issues. He's a longtime rival of Bob Vanderplat's, and Gross says the division among conservative evangelicals will end up weakening their impact in the caucuses.
If you've got 4 people that are acceptable and you're dividing your minority votes among 4 people, you're clearly not going to have the impact you did last time.
Please help me welcome the former U.S. Speaker, Newt Gingrich.
When Gingrich was atop the polls in Iowa, Bob Vanderplat said the state's conservative evangelicals were likely to end up uniting behind the former speaker.
There's probably nobody more prepared to handle the environment in which we exist today than Speaker Gingrich because of his historical knowledge and his ability to articulate and to be decisive.
Vanderplat says Gingrich won points by affirming a marriage pledge that the family leader presented to the GOP field. The former speaker wrote that he opposed gay marriage and would uphold the institution of marriage through personal fidelity to his spouse.
he's got a lot of baggage. And I'm not just talking about political baggage.
Yeah.
Couple of broken marriages, some serious infidelity in the past.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't trust him. Do you trust him now? Do you think he's a changed man?
The short answer to that is yes, I do. And part of that is that Speaker Gingrich and I have had this conversation several years ago, not several weeks ago. So it's not a road to Des Moines conversion, which we see way too often, Mitt Romney. And for those of us of the Christian faith, the heart of our faith is forgiveness.
But even though the former speaker was at the time leading in the polls and Vanderplat seemed to be ready to endorse him, some of Iowa's conservative evangelicals weren't willing to make that leap of faith.
God believes that when it comes to leadership, character is king.
Oskaloosa pastor Bill Tweed says Gingrich isn't the most reliable social conservative in the race. Tweed takes exception to the former speaker's support for abortion rights for rape victims and his endorsement of some gun control legislation.
I'm more of an ideologue. I see it through the eyes of principle.
The lack of consensus among Iowa's conservative evangelicals has opened up opportunities for the candidates they don't support, Ron Paul and Mitt Romney in particular. Republican Doug Gross says he hopes that come caucus night, the state's conservative evangelicals will end up looking for the same thing as the rest of the GOP.
Who can beat Barack Obama? They're going to tell you there's all these ideological things, and there's subsets of every group that have these ideological questions, and they want a totally principled candidate that's consistent with that ideology. But at the end of the day, the person who's going to win the caucuses in Iowa is the person the Republicans think have the best chance of beating Barack Obama.
But that advice didn't make it any easier for Iowa conservative kingmaker Bob Vanderplat to crown any of the candidates with an endorsement. When he seemed to be leaning towards backing Gingrich a month before caucus day, an organizer for the family leader reminded Vanderplat that conservative evangelicals remain divided.
A lot of our people are Bachman or Santorum.
Yeah, we hear a lot of that. But there's also, I mean, if you looked at the latest poll, Gingrich has got way more evangelical vote and support than they do.
As Gingrich's momentum slowed, the board of Vanderplat's group couldn't reach agreement. And just 2 weeks before caucus night, the organization announced that it wouldn't endorse any of the candidates. Vanderplat decided to give his personal endorsement to Rick Santorum, who's been running well behind the frontrunners in Iowa. Last week, Vanderplat vigorously denied published reports that he sought up to $1 million to endorse one of the candidates. Santorum said he recalled a conversation with Vanderplat about money, but insisted it wasn't about paying for an endorsement, only about raising money to publicize it. Now, with the caucuses only days away, polls suggest conservative evangelicals in Iowa still haven't coalesced around a single candidate. Doug Gross says in the long run, that's a good thing for the GOP.
The social conservatives are a power within the Republican Party. They're particularly a power in the caucuses, but they are not the majority power. They don't pick the winner. You can't be a governing party and have a minority control you. You become a minority party if that occurs. And the focus of our parties are to win elections to carry out results, not to carry out results by losing elections.
This is Need to Know.
It used to be said that even talking about possible cuts in Social Security benefits was the third rail of American politics. A mere mention of it could kill a run for the White House. But this year, reforming Social Security is a big part of the conversation. And so, too, is what's been a third rail issue in Iowa, ending ethanol subsidies. As Need to Know's Win Rosenfeld discovered during a visit there this past summer, the unmentionable is suddenly being mentioned.
We all think we know Iowa. After all, it's America's heartland. Pork chops, red barns, and corn. Lots and lots and lots of corn. 20 million bushels of the stuff gets turned into ethanol every year here at the Lincoln Way refinery in central Iowa.
One of these is about a day's worth of production for us.
And despite, or maybe because of, the refinery's remote location, it's a place of great interest to those looking to kick off a bid for the White House. Every 4 years, CEO Rick Bream shakes a lot of hands.
We've had Senator McCain come through.
In fact, in every election since 1996, every presidential nominee from both parties posed for an ethanol-friendly photo op somewhere in Iowa. That's because they think they know Iowa too. So, what exactly is their equation for running here? Well, traditionally, it's gone something like this. Making Iowans happy means making corn producers happy. And making corn producers happy means supporting the multi-billion-dollar government ethanol subsidies every year. Native Iowan David Oman is a former chief of staff to 2 Iowa Republican governors. He co-chaired a bipartisan commission under a Democratic administration and also worked on many campaigns here in the Hawkeye state.
I think there is a perception on a national level that for years, the way you ran in Iowa was you came in and you said, I'm for ethanol subsidies, and if you weren't saying that, then you just don't even come. Is that your take also?
I think there's a perception that all roads to and through Iowa lead through ethanol.
But this year, Oman says, the candidates are taking a new tack. In a presidential race that often seems a contest over who can cut the most government spending, almost all the Republican contenders support a phase out of ethanol subsidies. The notable exception is Newt Gingrich, a staunch supporter of the subsidies.
Even 4 or 5 years ago, it was politically safe for a candidate to come in and say they supported ethanol. Now it's not quite so dangerous to say that they don't.
Liz Neiman and her husband Justin will be at the Republican caucuses next week. They own a family farm in the northeastern Iowa town of Delhi.
We've been corn farmers. My dad is, my grandfather has, and his dad were, and I'm sure before that they were too.
Every year they grow hundreds of acres of corn and say they sell about half of it to ethanol producers. So the economics of ethanol matters a lot to them.
You've seen the pendulum swing on it. It's went from ethanol is great, it's a renewable fuel, how could you be against it, to now ethanol's up and going, do we really need to keep subsidizing it?
In fact, those subsidies, amounting to about $6 billion in 2011, will expire by the end of the year. And there's just not that much pushback. For example, a poll from the Des Moines Register found that 76% of likely Republican caucus goers say they'd consider a candidate who opposed ethanol subsidies. And both of Iowa's senators, a Republican and a Democrat, voted earlier this year to phase them out. The question then is, what's turned ethanol subsidies from a sacred cow into a sacrificial lamb?
We have an accumulating national debt that no one could have envisioned a couple of years ago. And Iowans understand that. It would be hypocritical for us to say that Washington needs to retard spending or cut other programs or dial back, but don't ever touch us.
So are these the rare Americans who are willing to take a major hit in the pocketbook for the good of the country? Well, maybe in part, but there are a couple of things you need to know. One, they want other energy producers to share the pain.
There are people who say, look, we'll take a subtraction of subsidies, but let's do the same thing for others. With
petroleum?
Petroleum, absolutely.
David Oman points out that the oil and gas industries get billions every year in subsidies and will likely continue to for the foreseeable future. But regardless of what happens with petroleum, for the time being at least, many here can afford to produce corn without the subsidies because business is booming. In fact,
4 out of every 10 ears of corn in the U.S. end up at ethanol refineries like this one. That's a big business, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon, no matter what happens to existing ethanol subsidies.
The ethanol industry is now the single biggest user of U.S. corn, and corn is in lots of other stuff too. It's in Pop-Tarts, and chewing gum, and cosmetics, and adhesives. It's even in fiberglass. And the price of Iowa farmland is up, way up. A whopping 32% from just last year.
Prices were real low 10 years ago, $2 a bushel and under, and farmers were not making money, and they thought ethanol would be a good way to help bring the price up, and it did. The price of corn.
In fact, corn is now selling for more than 3 times as much as it was in 2001.
You know, this is a good ag economy right now. We have probably a record farm income coming into farmers and producers across the country.
Tom Vilsack is the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. He's always in high demand for photo ops at the Iowa State Fair, having once been a popular governor here.
During the course of my time as governor, we substantially encouraged the ethanol industry.
But like a lot of Iowans, Vilsack, a Democrat and longtime champion of ethanol, now agrees that the industry could go without subsidies. But that's because, even without them, federal law mandates that by 2022, 36 billion gallons of America's fuel has to come from ethanol and other renewables. So even without direct subsidies, ethanol will end up in our gas tanks. Plus, in August, the Department of Agriculture announced a major new deal with what might sound like a very unlikely business partner, the Navy.
We're essentially going to build a commercial aviation and marine fuel industry from biofuel that the Department of Defense and the Navy will use to fuel the jets and the ships of our Navy.
We could run aircraft carriers on corn?
We can run aircraft carriers on fuel which is bio-based, produced in the United States. It may not be corn. It may be algae. It may be municipal waste.
Of course, it may indeed be corn. But corn notwithstanding, Iowa is the first caucus state and still looms large in our election year calculations. And understanding this state means understanding that the political narrative has changed here. This time around, Iowans like Liz Neiman and her husband Justin are hoping for a more nuanced conversation at the January caucus.
The political spectrum is wide and broad. We can discuss a lot of other things than just ethanol. Whether I vote for or against somebody will not be based off one issue of ethanol. There's a whole lot of other things we'll discuss while you're here.
What do you really know about Iowa? Probably not as much as Michael Gartner, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was the top editor at the Des Moines Register for a decade and later served as the president of the state's Board of Regents. In our American Voices segment, Gartner gives Iowa to us straight.
This is Iowa. It's a state with more than 3 million people, 19 million pigs, and 67 million chickens. None of the hogs or chickens vote. Lots of the people don't either. It's a state where people take pride in their first-in-the-nation caucuses and take offense if they haven't had a cup of coffee in the church basement with every candidate. But only 10% of registered Republicans and independents likely will show up for the GOP caucuses on January 3rd. It's a state that is almost evenly divided politically. There are more independent voters than Democrats, and more Democrats than Republicans. But the numbers are pretty close. Republican Chuck Grassley, in his 6th term in the United States Senate, is very conservative. Democrat Tom Harkin, in his 5th term, is very liberal. It's a state that, above all, values dignity and equality, a pattern set by the very first Supreme Court decision in 1839 that freed a black man named Ralph, who was captured and was being returned to his former owner in Missouri. It's a state where 2 years ago, the Supreme Court handed down that ruling that equality means people of the same sex may marry one another, and where the voters then threw out 3 of the justices who made that ruling. It's a state that produced Nobel Peace Prize winner Norman Borlaug, who through his Green Revolution saved more lives than any person on earth, but who regretted all his life that he never played second base for the Chicago Cubs. It's a state where Bob Feller was born and Amelia Bloomer died. He was a fastball pitcher who threw 3 no-hitters. She was a suffragist who popularized pantaloons. It's a state with 99 counties, 951 towns and cities, and 347 school districts. It has 25,000 bridges and 27 million acres of cropland. But the most famous field is the Field of Dreams. It's a state whose 2 big universities forego millions of dollars by naming their stadiums not after big corporations or donors, but after great young men, a Heisman Trophy winner who died in World War II, and a black tackle who was trampled to death in a football game in 1923. It's a state where Meredith Willson grew up to write The Music Man and to note that Iowans are so, by God, stubborn we could stand touching noses for a week at a time and never see eye to eye. But we'll give you our shirt and a back to go with it if your crops should happen to die. That's Iowa.
That's it for this edition of Need to Know. For more, join us online anytime at the Need to Know site at pbs.org. Scott Simon will be here next week, and from all of us here at Need to Know, Happy New Year.